Hi guys, how you doing? I received a request to do a video on patriarchy in India. So here goes. Patriarchy theory, also known as the Bible for feminists. Now, feminist patriarchy theory states men had all the power throughout history and men arranged society to benefit men at the expense of women. Now, for patriarchy theory to be true, we'd have to say that gender roles all throughout history was a social construct with no biological basis. If we go back to hunter-gatherer times, or even take the case of some tribes present today, completely cut off from the rest of society, we can understand with ease how these gender roles came into play. Human children are helpless after birth and have among the longest duration of helplessness in comparison to other species. A child, when born, has to be looked after for several years before he can be independent. The survival of the child was invariably connected to the survival of the mother. The man, however, could take the risk to protect his partner and in turn his genetic progeny to pass on his genes. His survival is not directly tied to the continuation of his genes. So if we dissect this from a logical standpoint, it would be comprehensible that men went out to hunt and bring in resources while the women stayed at home and looked after the kid and hut a home or whatever. Now, it is rational to say that gender roles, although socially constructed, was dictated by biology and survival. There is another way of looking at it. Let's say there's a tribe of 10 men and 10 women. Hypothetically, let's say one pregnancy leads to one child. If women were sent out to hunt and provide resources, the death of one or two women during the hunt would hinder the progress of the tribe, as 8 women can only give birth to 8 children every 9 months or so. Of course, this is purely for explanation basis. Let's take the case where men are the ones who bring in resources. The death of 1, 2, or even 5 men would not have the same effect as the previous scenario. The 5 remaining men could still father 10 babies every 9 months or so from the 10 women. The safety of women was given paramount importance the minute this was identified and understood. Unfortunately, this, I believe, is also the birth of male disposability and male sacrifice. I believe gender roles as such were socially constructed, but again, strongly based on biology. Any other division of labor would not have made our species the dominant force on this planet. Moving to recent times, a study done in 2004 about in-group bias showed that women possess this bias while men do not. It also stated that men would more often than not act in the interest of women. Patriarchy theory was created stating that men built society to benefit all men at the expense of women. This study by itself could tear it apart, but we can't base the disapproval of a theory just on one study. Of course, the feminists haven't proven their theory, so it completely takes the onus of us to disprove it, but even then, what the hell, huh? Men would more often than not act in the interest of women. Of course, this request was to talk about patriarchy in India. It does not matter which culture we talk about because we all were hunter-gatherer societies once. Now, I'm not a historian, a scientist, a researcher, nor do I have a beautiful mind. So from here on out, what I say is my conclusion from what I have read, understood, and the knowledge I have acquired about our history. If I do make errors, please feel free to correct me. I'm always open to criticism, for I am not perfect and I can learn from your input. Based in scriptures and the holy books, women were given the figure of a god in a household. Mata Pita Guru Devam is a common adage used in Hinduism. In English, that comes down to mother, father, teacher, and God. That is a priority of respect that you give. The mother brings you into this world, so she should have the utmost respect. She then introduces you to the father, and they both together take you to the teacher, and the teacher then shows you the way of God. To be honest, I'm an atheist and I do not believe in God or any kind of higher power. But when I'm talking about this, I have a point, just bear with me. Our ancient literature has always shown women to be godlike and as such should be respected without question. I'm not an expert in Ramayana, but the story is about the abduction of Sita, wife of Rama, and how he marches an entire army in order to save her from Ravana's clutches. You might be wondering, why the hell is this guy talking about religious books in a talk about patriarchy? Well, while the story might be fiction, it portrays what men were expected and obligated to do in ancient times for women. Similar to recent media representations of how men should treat women and sacrifice for them, it enforces the role of protector. Whether life imitates art or art imitates life, we are clear on what role has always been expected of a man. Moving on, Sati is a topic not many like to pick up and talk about, but hey, I thought I'll give it a shot. It was the practice of widows voluntarily jumping into the fire with their dead husbands, or in some cases, they were forced into it. The origin of this practice has been widely debated. Even though it has been infamously attributed to India, the first proof of its existence was in Nepal in 464 AD. History classes in school taught us, Indians, that sati was practiced and prevalent all over India. The truth, though, is far from it. Sati was never recorded in any of the Hindu scriptures. India did practice a lot of Hinduism, and if sati was part of Hinduism, it would have been mentioned in the writings. It was similar to how Egyptian pharaohs had servants and utensils buried with them to serve them in the afterlife. Sati, or Johar, as the Rajputs called it, was practiced mostly in Rajput communities. Now, these communities were mostly settled in northwest India, which was a possible entry point for invasion. Women in those communities would sacrifice themselves in order to avoid the consequences of invasion, consequences such as rape and slavery. The best example for this would be from Game of Thrones, when Cersei Lannister was ready to poison herself, her son, and commit suicide if they had lost the war in the second season finale. I think it was the second season, or was it third? Yeah, one of them. Anyway, what triggered the increased practice of sati was the so-called suicide of Rani Padmini. She was praised for her sacrifice, and women who did not die with their husbands were shamed for not doing so. Well, there were a lot of women who voluntarily did them as well. This was where it actually took the ominously negative turn. It was adopted in many societies in India, but the entire nation was not in support of this practice. And it wasn't rampant as one would think. There were several cases where relatives would force the widows into the fire in order to gain property. It did get misused to a certain extent, like most things in history. I'm in no way trying to condone the practice of sati. I hated this part of our history, but wanted an insight into why we would do such a horrendous thing. This wasn't patriarchy forcing women to die with their husbands. The patriarchal overlords didn't get up one day and wonder, how can we oppress the women today? There are always reasons behind the origin of something. While the origin of sati made sense, the rest of it just completely went out of hand. And I believe fear was the creator of such a heinous practice. Moving on, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the majority of Indians were manual laborers who labored in the hot sun all throughout the day in order to feed their family. If you're thinking, well, women help too, but most jobs back then consisted of hard physical labor, which most women would be unable to do. For example, the plowing of farms were done mostly by men, while the seeding and harvesting, which does not take the same physical labor, were done by women. And if you ask me what I would prefer to do 100 years ago, to be a farmer working in the field or the wife, it would be a really easy choice for me. Why would the so-called oppressors risk their health to shelter and feed the oppressed? The only men who would benefit from the patriarchy theory would be the men in power, the kings and princes. One can guess what percentage of men were royal. And during World War II, 2.5 Indian men fought for the British because we were under British rule and called the British Raj at that point of time. Now, did these men go to fight the war because it benefited them in any way? It was expected of them. It was their duty and they obliged. Were these men privileged? Now, India does not have conscription like the UK or the US. Our military is full of volunteers. Now, India has the largest military of volunteers. The army comprises 96% men and the navy 95%. These are the men that protect and die for our country, and yet feminists say they are privileged. Towards the end of the British rule, several men and women fought for freedom. If you look through our history, the famous freedom fighters were predominantly male. They took up the mantle instead of asking women to do it. The Taj Mahal, a true testament to the architects of yesteryear, was built in memory of Shah Jahan's wife Mumtaz. I'm certain that majority of workers, if not all, were men. Most women would not be able to handle the physical strength required. These men, even though they were paid, did not do so for their own greed, but to provide for their family as was expected of them. How many times in history has the oppressors worked to their bones to feed and shelter the oppressed? I looked into some matrilineal societies in India because I wanted to compare them to the patrilineal society or the patriarchal society as they call it. The Khasi from Meghalaya would be an apt example. In this society, the individuals take their mother's name and not the father's. The lineage is traced through the female gender. I looked at the Khasi to see if these matrilineal societies had any difference in gender roles. The sons leave home when they turn 18 to be trained in trades in a bachelor house, after which they get married and move into the wife's home. If a mother has more than the one daughter, usually the youngest inherits the house while the other has to move out. In this situation, a plot of land is given to the daughter by the mother. This is where it gets fun. It is the duty of the husband to build the house in the plot of land. The wife is the head of the family even though the house was built by the labor of the husband. The man is also expected to work for the household in all economic aspects. The men were given the dangerous tasks of traveling to other communities to deliver messages because of their greater physical endurance. The rougher, tougher, and riskier jobs were dealt out to men. Another example would be the Nair families in Kerala, where they employed a matrilineal family line. In this society, boys had to join the Kalari, a military training school, at the age of 12, and they were allowed to leave when they turned 18. But they were expected to be available for military duty at a day's notice. The division of labor is the exact same thing as in a patrilineal society. The only difference is that men do the economic share of the work in matrilineal societies and gain nothing in return. This division of gender roles further add to the evolutionary explanation that gender roles were not purely social. Matrilineal societies employed similar gender roles to the patrilineal ones, or the patriarchal ones. In simplified terms, patriarchy was about self-sacrifice for the betterment of society, while matrilineal or matrilocal was putting men in danger for the betterment of society. Either way, men got the short end of the stick, being disposable. In the present era, there are several men going to the Middle Eastern countries to earn money, such as Dubai, Qatar, and so on. The ones that are well educated get good accommodation and also have the freedom of bringing their family along. But I'm more concerned with the uneducated or people who had only finished their schooling before taking up a trade. These men go to these countries and often have to share a room with 6 or 7 others. They send the lion's share of their wages back home, where their wife and kids live in 2-bedroom or even 3-bedroom homes. I've seen this firsthand. I live in a village, as I've mentioned before in my videos. I was lucky enough because my dad worked really hard and was able to give me an education abroad. I see men who go for 12 months straight, 11 months straight, and come back home for probably a month or so. These men do not receive benefits of any sort from their wives. They have to cook their own food, clean their own rooms, and do the laundry, which would usually be done by their wives if they were at home, since the wife didn't have jobs. His family leads a comfortable life while he toils away. But of course, even this is male privilege. The men who sail on ships as cleaners, engine drivers, and so on to earn so their family can survive also have the so-called male privilege. Now, because men were responsible for the safety and welfare of the family, he was rightly given the role of the head of the household. There were definitely men who misused his power. I will never refute their claim. But in general, they cared and looked after their family. Even now, if you ask the women in rural areas what they'd rather be doing, housework or the physical labor that men do, they will most definitely choose the housework. Only with the introduction of education has freedom been given to women to join the workforce. A lot of the current generation, some of the previous ones, have the option of going to schools and gaining education. It is intriguing, though, that women started asking for rights to work only after it has become so that physical labor is not of importance in a majority of the fields. And most women tend not to do work that requires physical labor if given an option. Also, this great patriarchal society called India had its first female prime minister in 1966, a mere 19 years after its freedom. She held the office for 12 years. She became the prime minister again in 1980 and remained in power till 1984, when she was sadly and unfortunately assassinated. Till date, she is the second longest serving prime minister of India. The patriarchy, right? And finally, in the fundamental rights of India, the right to equality clearly states that no one can be discriminated against based on their gender. It adds, though, that this clause does not stop the state from creating laws to protect women. This meant that only men can be discriminated against based on their gender. Is there a need of better proof that India, while patriarchal, does not fit the patriarchy theory? It was about self-sacrifice. It's about protecting women, and it still widely is. Thanks for listening, guys. Again, like I said, this was my understanding, my concoction. If anybody has any criticism, go ahead, fire away. I can only learn from it. If you have any comments, leave them below. And if you would like more videos, click the damn subscribe button. Cheers.